The boardroom on the 31st floor of the Ventara Health Analytics building had floor-to-ceiling windows that faced Lake Ontario, and on a clear April morning, the water below was the color of old pewter, flat and cold, and entirely indifferent to what was happening on the other side of the glass. Reed Stanton stood at the head of the long table in a slim-cut blazer that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. And he said the words that would live in that building's memory long after his name had been forgotten. He said that Adanna Obi's involvement in the company's core technical operations would be ending, effective immediately. He did not look at her while he said it. He looked at the board members arranged around the table, each one watching their hands, or their phones, or the water outside, and he spoke in the measured cadence of a man who had rehearsed the sentence twice that morning in front of a mirror. 9 senior engineers from firms in Vancouver, San Francisco, and London would be brought in to lead the platform modernization, he continued. Specialists, people with documented experience scaling enterprise health systems to populations in the tens of millions. The room was very quiet. Adanna Obi sat 3 chairs down from the head of the table. She was 42 years old, a black woman in a charcoal blazer she had owned for 6 years because she liked the way the pockets sat, and she listened to Reed Stanton conclude his announcement with the same expression she wore when she was deep in a debugging session at 2 in the morning, calm, focused, entirely unreadable. She did not grip the armrest. She did not scan the board members for sympathy. She looked at Reed Stanton once, briefly, the way a person looks at a thing they already understand, and then she looked at the window and the gray water beyond it and said nothing at all. When the meeting ended, she returned to her office, the one with the whiteboard wall she had covered in diagrams over 8 years, and she packed the things that mattered. A photograph of herself and her mother standing in front of a row house in Scarborough the day they painted the front door yellow. A USB drive that held nothing confidential, only her own notes. A small enamel pin shaped like a circuit board that her first intern had given her when the company hit 10,000 users. She left the whiteboard diagrams intact. Let whoever came next figure out what they meant. She said goodbye to Iris, the systems coordinator, who had been with Ventara since the 3rd year, and who looked at Adanna with the particular expression of someone trying not to let their face do what it wanted to do. Adanna squeezed her hand and told her the quarterly anomaly detection logs would need manual review until the new team found their footing, because there was a timing offset in the Alberta cluster that the automated flags didn't catch reliably. Then she walked out of the building through the glass lobby and onto the sidewalk along Bay Street, where the April wind came off the lake and hit her in the face like a reprimand. She stood there for one moment before walking to her car. She did not look back. Adanna Obi had built Ventara Health Analytics in the spare bedroom of a rented apartment in Scarborough over the course of 2 years, working nights after her day shifts in hospital administration. She had grown up 3 blocks from that apartment, the daughter of a woman who cleaned offices in the financial district, and a father who drove long-haul freight and was rarely home before 11. She had not attended a prestigious university. She had taken night courses in computer science at a community college, then through an online program that cost less per credit than a single textbook at the schools Reed Stanton had attended. What she had, and what no curriculum had ever given her, was 11 years of working inside Canadian hospitals, first as a file clerk, then records coordinator, then a systems analyst position she had essentially invented for herself by fixing things nobody had asked her to fix. She had watched patients lose time because record systems talked to each other in languages nobody had bothered to translate. She had watched clinical staff enter the same data 3 times across 3 platforms purchased in 3 different decades by 3 different administrators who had never compared notes. She understood the shape of the problem the way someone understands a familiar ache, not by reading about it, but by sitting with it, day after day, until its rhythms became part of her own. The algorithm she built, the one the company called the bridge, was not elegant in the way that academic software tended to be elegant. It did not follow textbook architecture. It was adaptive in a way she had never fully documented, because she had built it the way her mother had taught her to cook, by feel, by memory, by a kind of intuitive adjustment that arrived not from theory, but from 10,000 hours of noticing what actually happened versus what the manual said should happen. The bridge was the reason 47 hospitals across 4 provinces trusted Vantara with their data. It was the reason the company had grown from 12 employees to over 200. It was the reason, though Reed Stanton did not understand this yet, that the 9 engineers he had assembled would spend the next several weeks in a state of mounting, bewildered distress. The new team arrived on a Tuesday. They came with matching company laptops, standing reservations at a hotel 2 blocks from the office, and a confidence that was not arrogance exactly, but was close enough that the distinction barely mattered to the people who had been at Vantara long enough to know what they were looking at. 3 of them had published papers. 2 had helped scale platforms for companies with user bases larger than most Canadian provinces. They wore their expertise the way Reed Stanton wore his blazer, as a statement rather than a tool. Their first task, framed by Reed as a formality in his introductory briefing, was to stabilize and scale the bridge ahead of a major contract expansion into 2 new provinces. A deal worth close to $90 million, months in negotiation, with a technical review demonstration scheduled in 6 weeks. They opened the codebase on their first morning and spent most of the afternoon in silence. The bridge was not what any of them had expected. It operated on a logic that was internally consistent, but did not map neatly onto any framework they knew by name. The variable naming conventions were sometimes standard and sometimes inexplicable. There were sections where the code seemed to anticipate edge cases that should not have been possible to anticipate, correcting for anomalies in incoming data before standard validation would have caught them. One of the senior engineers, a specialist who had spent 8 years building data pipelines in Vancouver, stared at a particular function for 40 minutes before admitting quietly to the person next to him that he was not entirely sure what it was doing or why it was doing it correctly. They did not go to Iris with their questions, because Iris was a coordinator and they were architects. They did not pull the old documentation, because Reed had told them the documentation was outdated and the whole point was to move past it. They filed requests for additional environment access, pulled server logs going back 18 months, and began building their own parallel integration layer from scratch, confident their approach would be cleaner and more maintainable. 3 weeks in, the Alberta cluster began producing timing errors. Not large ones, not the kind that tripped automated alerts or generated incident reports. The kind that accumulated quietly, like water finding its way through a hairline crack, until one evening a hospital data coordinator in Calgary noticed that reconciliation reports were arriving 4 minutes behind their expected window. Then 6. Then 11. She filed a support ticket. The ticket was escalated. The new team looked at the logs and found nothing they recognized as a cause. They ran diagnostics. They reviewed configuration files. They compared the Alberta cluster's performance against the Ontario and British Columbia nodes and found statistical variations they could not explain. They brought in a cloud infrastructure specialist on a video call who spent 2 hours reviewing the architecture and concluded the problem was almost certainly in the adaptive waiting layer, a section of bridge code that none of them had successfully decoded. Reed received the first call from the board at 9 on a Wednesday evening. The board member who called was a woman in her 60s who had been investing in Canadian health tech for 20 years and had backed Vantara in its second year, specifically because she had watched Adanna explain the bridge on a whiteboard and believed, on that basis alone, that the company would work. She asked Reed directly whether the timeline for the provincial demonstration was still realistic. He told her it was. She did not sound as though she believed him, and she was correct not to. By the end of the 4th week, The timing offset had spread to 2 hospitals in Saskatchewan. The 9 engineers had produced a stack of analysis documents that were thorough, well-formatted, and entirely useless in terms of producing a solution. They had rebuilt the integration layer twice. They had replaced the monitoring framework. They had contracted an external security firm to audit the codebase and received a clean report, which solved nothing. One evening, long after the rest of the team had gone back to the hotel, the oldest of the 9 engineers sat alone in the office. Dennis Chu was 61, gray at the temples, brought out of semi-retirement for his 30 years in enterprise systems architecture. He had spent the last 3 days doing something none of his colleagues had thought to do, reading through the company's original technical documentation. Not the updated internal wiki, the archived from Vantara's first 4 years. Handwritten notes scanned and uploaded, version history logs, change logs that nobody had touched since they were written. He found Adanna's name in places that surprised him. Not on the official architecture documents, which credited the engineering team collectively, but in the granular notes. In the comments embedded inside the oldest layers of the bridge's core functions. In a series of handwritten diagnostic notes, photographed and uploaded to a shared folder nobody had opened in 6 years. Written in the precise, observation-dense shorthand of someone who had spent years translating between the language of machines and the language of the people who depended on them. He cross-referenced the changelogs against the company's early incident reports. The pattern was not subtle once you were looking for it. Every time the bridge had encountered a new class of data inconsistency, a class that should have broken the adaptive waiting layer, there was a corresponding note in Adanna's handwriting. And then, always within hours, a silent adjustment in the codebase with no author tag pushed directly to the main branch before the company had formalized its commit protocols. Dennis sat in the empty office for a long time after he understood what he was reading. In 30 years of enterprise systems work, he had seen a great many things, but he had not often seen a proprietary technical architecture built from the inside out by a single person's intuition about what a specific class of real-world problem actually looked like. And he had never seen that person's name left entirely off the public record of it. He found a paper from 8 years earlier, published by a venture partner at the firm that had led Vantara's Series A, presenting a framework for adaptive health data integration as the partner's original contribution to the field. The underlying model it described was the bridge. Dennis went to Reed Stanton's office the next morning, with a printed copy of the paper and a tablet loaded with the archived changelogs and Adanna's handwritten notes. He set them on the desk and waited while Reed read. Reed read for 11 minutes. When he looked up, his face had the expression of a man who had just realized that the floor he was standing on was not as solid as he had assumed. He asked where Adanna Obi was now. Nobody in the company had maintained a direct line to her after she left. Her departure had been structured as a clean break. No consulting arrangement, no advisory role, nothing that would complicate the equity restructuring the board had been planning. It took human resources most of a day to find a current contact. And they found it not through any official record, but through Iris, who had stayed in touch by text message and did not hesitate for even a moment before providing the number. Adanna was working out of a shared office space in Kensington Market. She had been there for 6 weeks, building the early architecture of something new, and the people who shared the space with her described her as the person who arrived before anyone else in the morning, always with a thermos from the Tim Hortons on College Street, and who was extraordinarily good at fixing the building's unreliable router, which she had done twice without being asked. Reed drove there himself on a Thursday afternoon, without his assistant, without the 2 board members who had offered to come. He parked on a side street and walked into the building, which smelled like old wood and strong coffee, and the particular indoor quality of places where people are building things they care about. And he found Adanna at a standing desk in the corner by the window, working on a laptop, with the focused stillness he would later describe as the most unnerving kind of confidence he had ever been in the presence of. She did not look startled to see him. She did not look angry. She looked at him the way she had looked at him in the boardroom 6 weeks earlier, with a calm that was not warmth and not hostility, but something that was simply accurate. And she waited for him to speak. He told her they needed her back. He told her the bridge was degrading in ways the team could not solve, and that a $90 million expansion was in serious jeopardy. He told her he understood that the circumstances of her departure had not been handled correctly. She listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she said no. The word landed in the room without drama, and it was the first time in the entire ordeal that anyone had used it in response to something Reed Stanton had asked for. He asked her, almost gently, why she had never fought back when the board restructured her role out from under her. She set her laptop aside and told him something that was not in any company document or any press profile written about Vantara's rise. She told him that 12 years ago, when the bridge was still a prototype running on a second-hand server in her spare bedroom, she had brought it to a venture partner who had then presented it to investors as a framework he had guided and refined. With Adanna's name reduced to a footnote in the technical appendix, nobody read. She had said nothing because she was 29 years old, with no contacts in that world. And she understood that the company she had built from nothing would survive only if the money came through. And the money would come through only if she did not burn the room down to make a point. She told Reed this without bitterness. Not because she had forgotten what it felt like to sit in that room, but because she had made a decision many years ago that carrying bitterness forward cost more than she could afford. She had never done any of it for the recognition, she told him. She had done it because she had spent 11 years watching people lose access to their own health records, because the systems holding them were built by people who had never had to use them. She could not stand that, and she knew how to fix it. Reed was quiet for a long time. He was 36 years old, and he was not a bad person, but he had been trained his entire career to read value through a very specific lens, and that lens had never once included a room like this one, or a person like the woman standing across from him. He thought about the whiteboard diagrams she had left intact in her office. He thought about the paper Dennis had placed on his desk. He thought about 47 hospitals, and what it actually meant that they were still running. He came back the next day, and the day after that. On his third visit, he brought printed personnel files for the entire technical staff and asked her, without any pitch attached, which of them showed the kind of instinct she had spent her career developing. She answered his questions, and for the first time since she had walked out onto Bay Street, something in her expression shifted toward something that was not quite warmth, but was in the same neighborhood. He offered her title back. She said no. He offered more equity. She said no. He offered a new title, and she asked him to stop offering her things and tell her what he was actually asking. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he was asking her to come back because without her, the thing she had built would fail, and a great many people who depended on it would be hurt by that. She walked to the window and looked at the street below, at the fruit vendor on the corner, at the woman in the yellow raincoat walking a dog too large for the sidewalk, and she thought about the patients in the Alberta hospitals whose reconciliation windows were slipping by minutes that would eventually become hours. She agreed to return under one condition, not a title and not money. She asked that every person on the technical team, from the 9 new engineers to the junior coordinators who had been there since the beginning, be formally credited in Vantara's documentation for the work they actually contributed. She wanted no project to move forward without that record being accurate and public and permanent. Reed agreed without hesitation. He would understand later that it was the easiest agreement he had made in years, and the most important. When Adanna walked back into the Vantara building on a Monday morning, the technical floor went quiet in the particular way of a space where people have been told something is coming, but have not quite believed it until it arrives. Iris met her at the elevator without a word and handed her a coffee that was already the right temperature. And they walked together to the server monitoring room where the 9 engineers were gathered around 3 screens, their expressions carrying the specific exhaustion of people who have been intelligent and wrong for too long. Adanna looked at the displays for a few minutes without touching anything. She asked 2 questions about the Alberta node configuration that nobody had thought to ask. The answers, which Dennis provided by pulling up a file nobody else had opened, confirmed what she had already suspected. The bridge's adaptive weighting layer was responding to a daylight-saving adjustment in the Alberta server environment. Implemented 6 weeks earlier, just after her departure, by a junior technician who had not known the bridge, contained a manual timing override buried in its core layer. That override was documented only in Adanna's handwritten notes, which nobody had read. She had written it 8 years ago, after a 2-day disruption at a hospital in Edmonton, staying awake for 36 hours to build a permanent correction into the system by hand. She had written it in the shorthand of someone who expected to be there to explain it. She opened a terminal window. She typed 11 lines of code. She adjusted a single timestamp parameter by 4 hours and 17 minutes, a correction that accounted for the specific way the Alberta cluster's legacy hardware interpreted its environment variables. The adjustment took 4 minutes and 20 seconds. When she ran the validation, the timing offset disappeared across every node. All 3 screens cleared simultaneously. Dennis let out a breath that came from somewhere deeper than his lungs. The 9 engineers stood in a room that had just shown them something their collective credentials had not prepared them for, and not one of them spoke for a long while. Then the youngest, a woman who had built data pipelines in San Francisco for 5 years and had never once been humbled by a codebase before, asked Adanna if she would be willing to walk them through the bridge's architecture, layer by layer. Adanna said yes. What followed in the weeks before the provincial demonstration was something Vantara had never seen. Engineers trained to work from the top down sat beside coordinators who had been working from the ground up, and Adanna moved between them, translating not just the code, but the thinking behind it. The years of observation that had shaped each decision, the patients and the nurses and the data entry clerks she had watched before she had ever written a single function. Dennis took notes in a small notebook and occasionally read back something Adanna had said 3 days earlier, and she would nod, and everyone in the room would write it down again. Reed restructured the documentation program so that every contribution was attributed accurately, and he commissioned a formal audit of the company's intellectual property record, going back to its founding. What came out of it included a formal addendum to Vantara's IP filings, listing Adanna Obi as the primary architect of the bridge, a correction that arrived 12 years after it should have. She did not mark the occasion publicly. She mentioned it to her mother from her kitchen in Scarborough, standing at the counter while her mother listened, and then said, in the tone she had always used when she considered something to be simply the truth, arriving at its correct location, that she had known it from the beginning. Adanna accepted a new role she negotiated herself. Not director, not chief. The title they settled on was Principal Systems Architect, which was what she had been doing for 12 years, only now the nameplate on the office door said so. She kept the office with the whiteboard wall. She added 3 more diagrams in the first week. On the day of the provincial demonstration, the bridge ran without a single error across all 47 nodes. The 2 new provincial systems came online in sequence, their integration clean and stable, the timing windows precise to the second. The government representatives and health authority officials who had traveled to Toronto watched a live data feed on 3 screens in Vantara's boardroom and asked questions that Adanna answered from a chair at the middle of the table, not at the head, not at the back, but in the center where the work actually lived. Reed sat at the far end of the room and spoke less than anyone. He had prepared remarks about the platform's development and revised them 5 times. In the end, he delivered them quietly, with none of the polished confidence that had once been his default, because somewhere in the weeks between that Thursday, in Kensington Market, and this afternoon facing the lake, something in him had genuinely shifted. He understood now that the thing he had spent his career learning to measure was not the same as the thing he had been trying to lead. The spreadsheet version of Adanna Obi was a rounding error. The actual version had built something that 47 hospitals trusted with the records of millions of people, in her spare bedroom, with night course credentials and 11 years of paying close enough attention to understand what no one else had yet thought to ask. Long after the government officials had left, and the building had settled into its evening quiet, Reed found Adanna in the server room, running her last check of the day. The same one she had always run last, because she trusted the machine, but she also believed that trust was something you renewed rather than assumed. He asked her what she had actually been listening for all those years. The thing the diagnostics kept missing. She thought about it before answering. She thought about her mother's kitchen, and the sound of a freight truck in the early morning, and the fluorescent hum of a hospital corridor at 3 a.m., when the building was as close to quiet as hospitals ever got. And a woman in records who had shown her, 20 years ago, how to read what a patient's file was actually saying, rather than what it had been formatted to display. She told him that every system, whether it ran on servers or on something older than servers, would show you exactly what it needed if you stopped assuming you already knew the answer and simply stayed patient long enough to let it speak. Diagnostics could tell you what was wrong, she said. Only attention could tell you what was needed. She closed the terminal window, picked up her thermos, and walked to the elevator. Reed stood in the empty server room for a while after she left, surrounded by the quiet hum of machines that were finally running well, and thought about all the things he had been certain of 12 months ago, that he was no longer certain of at all, and understood that this was not a loss, but the beginning of something he did not yet have a name for. Outside, Toronto was doing what it always did after a long winter. Coming back to itself slowly, the trees along the side streets beginning to show the first pale suggestions of leaves. The lake at the bottom of the hill, flat and quiet, and catching the last of the April light. Adanna drove back to Scarborough with the windows down, and somewhere on the Gardener she permitted herself the small and private satisfaction of a person who had known, all along, exactly how the story would end.